Everybody to our Thursday, February 13th, by name list and coordinate access community of practice call. We're very excited to have everyone that's here. We're excited to have our presenter and to have another session in this series that we will be doing monthly. So I think we'll have some great information today. I think it's a great opportunity to hear some information about someone who, or a community who has been an infant in this process and yet see the great work that they've been able to do in a short period of time, and hopefully be able to provide some insights to those of you who are also on the call. And if there's others who are on the call who have experience with coordinated access, it'll be great to get your perspective on sort of what this stage was like for you as well later on. So we're really happy to have you all here, and we'll get moving forward. See if my slide's going to advance here. There we go. So I'm Wally Check. I'm the Director of Training for the Training and Technical Assistance Program with the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. And as I always like to point out, look how awesomely handsome I am. Actually, that's just me trying to build up my own self-esteem. But anyway, I've been having the privilege of being able to host many of these webinars, both in the by name list and coordinated access world, as well as our Housing First stream of things. But great to be here, and great to be part of this process. Again, just a refresher about the Canadian Alliance and who we are. We have multiple facets of the Canadian Alliance. It has grown very rapidly in the last couple of years. Most of you are familiar for sure with the National Conference, and many of you have attended that conference. Just as a reminder, as it says, the next conference coming up is in Toronto in 2020, so we'll be looking forward to that. We also have Built for Zero Canada, which is also pretty much solely about coordinated access and by name lists, but it's a very structured program that that communities can be involved in. There's only a certain number of communities they have the capacity to work with at one time, and so some are involved with that. And then we have our training and technical assistance, which I'm the director of. And then of course we have our allied networks, which is a series of different organizations and programs that are operating that the Canadian Alliance is supporting. An example of that would be the National Alliance to End Rural and Remote Homelessness. There's a lived experience group. There is a veterans section and component. So I would encourage you to go in and take a look at that part of the Canadian Alliance website, and you can see who's all part of allied networks there. But we support several other organizations and movements within the country. Our mission, the Canadian Alliance mission, of course, is pretty simple and basic, but we want to help communities across Canada end homelessness. And of course, there's some pretty lively and big goals that the federal government has set as well, to be able to reduce chronic homelessness by 50% by 2028. So we're looking forward to that happening, coming to fruition. We want to highlight reaching home with the federal government, as the work that we are doing in this area is funded in part through them, and their generous contributions and agreements that we have make a lot of this possible. So we're grateful to them, and always happy to work with the federal government. So community of practice calls, just to give you a bit of a briefer on what they look like. Community of practice calls are slightly different than webinars, in that community of practice is meant to have that discussion and conversation and support of each other. It is going to be an hour in length maximum if we need that amount of time, but the presentation is a little bit shorter, which allows for more of that time for conversations. So as I said, this is being recorded, and the recording of this, as well as the PDF version of the slides, will be available probably by the end of the day today, for people to go on, and if you want to re-watch the webinar, or if there are people in your community that would like to see it, or if you want to look at it later on some other time, you can do that. And then, like I said, you'll be able to also see the slides that our presenter is providing. Again, as you're coming up with questions, as the presenter is talking, if you have questions, feel free to type those questions in. It'd be preferable if you use the Q&A feature, but the chat feature is okay also. And so it's up to you, whatever you feel most comfortable with. And I'll be monitoring those as we go, but we'll wait until the presentation is finished before we open it up to have those discussions. And our agenda is very simple. We've done our introductions. In a moment, I will turn the screen over to our presenter, and she will do her thing, and then we'll have time for Q&A. And then when we're done with that part, I'll actually share a couple of other things with you, in particular the upcoming webinars, and then we'll end our webinar for the day. So it's that simple. So I am actually going to stop sharing my screen and introduce you to Lynda Dechief from Nelson. And Lynda is a consultant there and has been given the task of kind of leading the beginning stages of the development of the system, the framework around coordinated access in Nelson, British Columbia. And so, as I mentioned, they've been kind of infants in this process, and Lynda has started from ground zero and has done a lot of work very quickly to start getting the community ready to actually build their coordinated access system. And so I wanted her to be able to share insights that she has about what it's been like to go through that process up until now, and share any highlights and tips or tricks with all of you that might be beneficial in your efforts if you're in the same place. So Lynda, feel free to take over the screen. I'll remind you maybe to close out your video so you don't have to deal with your internet challenges, and otherwise we'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Wally. So I'm just sharing my screen and starting my presentation. There, can you see that first slide?
We can, and now, yeah, there you go, perfect.
Great. So I'm going to be sharing today lessons from the community just getting started. And I'm going to start with introductions of myself and my town, and I'll talk about our process to date, and then share with you all some lessons that I've learned along the way. So this is me. My favorite color is orange and always has been, as you can see from the orange polyester jumpsuit and orange pop mustache. As Wally said, I'm an independent consultant, and I've been working over the years here in Nelson on lots of different projects connected to the work that we're now doing on coordinated access, including a street culture collaborative, a street out, helping getting the street outreach team up and running, and then I managed it for its first year, facilitating a fentanyl task force, helping to develop an adult support recovery center, writing some grants in support of our advocacy center, and helping to develop and then also coordinate a project called the Safe Kids and Youth Coordinated Response, which has some really similar elements to coordinated access. So a lot of and really multidisciplinary, and are really about bringing people together across agencies and disciplines and community and government to work together to support individuals facing various issues. And I do a ton of different things related to all of these projects. And in doing so, I've worked with many of the agencies that are involved in the Nelson Committee on Homelessness, which is the community advisory body for our Reaching Home funding and is overseeing the development of coordinated access. So that's me. Next, I'll introduce you to my town, Nelson. You can see where we are in BC. We're in the southeast corner. It's a region called the West Kootenays, and you can see that in the right-hand map. And so Nelson's the biggest city in our region, but Castle Garden Trail that you can see on the map are also a significant size. And they have a number of communities, including those two, have their own multi-service agencies. So it's not as though Nelson is the hub for this larger rural area. It's more of a Tri-Cities hub. And there's lots of rural areas as well. So I think the population density is, you know what, I was going to say 1 person for every 2 square kilometers, but that seems really low, but I think that is correct. So people are, you know, centered in these towns, but there's lots of folks living rurally as well. And people really move between communities in accessing services. So we really try to work across communities and take a more regional perspective when it makes sense. So there's about 10,000 people here in Nelson proper, and in the larger region, there's about 60,000 people. And it's a really amazing place to live. It's gorgeous here. We're right on a lake. We're in the mountains. It's got a really artsy cultural vibe. It's great. If you have, unfortunately, market rentals are pretty expensive, but definitely for a small town. The median rent is $1,100, which is triple what people on income assistance or disability can afford. And even if people can't afford it, there's no vacancy. We've had a 0% vacancy rate for 3 years now. That doesn't mean there's no turnover. Places become available, but they're very quickly filled. And it means that landlords can be really choosy in who they rent to, and they're not usually choosing to rent to people who've been homeless, who are on income assistance, or who struggle with mental health or substance use or any other issues in their lives. We do have really great affordable housing and temporary housing programs and rent subsidies. They're unfortunately not enough. And we don't have any supportive housing. So for folks who are really struggling and are, you know, in that high acuity bracket, there's not really any adequate housing. There's nothing with 24/7 support for people. Trail, which is an hour away that you might remember from the map, they should have supportive housing built in the next year or two, and that's going to be the first supportive housing program in our region. As of April 13th, 2018, in our PIT count, 132 people were counted as homeless. The next PIT count is happening this April in 2 months. And you know, everybody's guess is that it's probably going to be higher. We're certainly not seeing things get any better. We do have a great continuum of community services here in Nelson, those specific homelessness survey programs, and such a great range of municipal police department. The library is really supportive of folks that are without homes. Our income assistance program, mental health and substance use, and other healthcare services are really part of that larger continuum, plus the affordable housing programs that we have. And we have really great relationships between all of those agencies and people. And, you know, I think that's partly a function of being in a small town. You know, we can really lament a lack of funding or the ability to have really specialized services like a women's specific shelter. But there's this level of accountability to having real respect and integrity in how we work in relationship to each other, because it's a small town. The chief of police is going to end up being your daughter's soccer coach, or you'll end up in a pottery class or a grocery lineup or on the chairlift with pretty much every single person you've ever been in a meeting with. So, you know, that's really humanizing and helpful in our relationships. You can't have road rage in my town, or that person that you end up shaking your fist at, you're going to end up knowing them. So, you know, there is that accountability in living in a small town that I think can be really helpful in all of us working together. So in terms of coordinated access, where we are at in the process is really the very beginning. So I've been at this for about 4 months now. Phases of coordinated access, we're right there in year 1 in terms of building awareness. So we're working hard to check off those 2 first boxes of making everybody aware of coordinated access and why it's important, and asking for support in implementing the next steps. So my steps so far, one time when I spoke with Wally, he gave that analogy of, you know, I'm just like drinking from the fire hose. And I think that's a pretty fair way to describe it. You know, I've just been doing so much information gathering. The Edmonton conference was just a couple of weeks after I started, and that was so great to be able to go and just spend 3 days going through the entire coordinated access stream, meeting so many other people who are in various stages of doing the same work, connecting with Wally and Jody and others, Michelle from the CAEH training and technical assistance. Kelowna and Kamloops are at very similar places to us. They're further ahead in some things. So it's been really helpful talking to them about what it is that they're doing and how it's working and so forth. We had a HIFIS workshop in Vancouver that I attended, which was also really helpful, and a trilateral meeting in Vancouver as well that was really helpful. And that was with the Reaching Home folks and other federal folks, and our provincial partners as well, including BC Housing and all of the 10 community entities here in BC that are funded by Reaching Home. We all got together and had some discussions. And so it's really been a process of just wrapping my head around all of that information and refining it so that I can share it here and distill it for my community. And I've mostly been doing that through monthly Nelson Committee on Homelessness meetings. And then we had a big awareness building event just a couple of weeks ago. And I'll tell you about that. It was 3 hours long. It was the morning from 9 to noon, and we had food, which I think is absolutely crucial when you bring people together, that you have food and drinks. So 42 people came to that, and it was a whole array of folks who are potential stakeholders in our coordinated access process. We had leaders, the frontline workers, folks from all the homelessness serving programs, housing programs. We had folks from City Council. We had 2 councillors and a councillor from Trail. Police were there, the chief of police and the beat cop. folks from our wonderful harm reduction agency, people with lived experience, folks from healthcare, from home care, mental health and substance use, and the emergency department, employment services, some friendly businesses, people from the regional district, the local family place, faith-based organizations, income assistance, and the Regional Supportive Housing Society in Trail. So we had local and regional representation. And we had folks there from BC Housing as well, which we're in a bit of a unique situation in BC, that BC Housing holds the HIFAS license for the whole province. And they also have their own model of what they call coordinated access and assessment. And that's a model we don't have here in Nelson because we don't have supportive housing, but that exists in other communities in BC. It's generally a bit of a smaller endeavor that's more about connecting people to vacancies in supportive housing, but they were really open to what we're trying to do here in Nelson, which is have a much bigger picture and many more of the community stakeholders involved in coordinated access as it's envisioned by Reaching Home. So what we did that morning was a land acknowledgement. Everybody in the room introduced themselves and their connection to homelessness. I talked about Reaching Home and its outcomes. And then we did an exercise that was one reality of homelessness here in our communities, in our community, that I called Barriers and Bright Spots. And it was essentially, we walked through the story of one person experiencing homelessness here in our small town. And it was created from a focus group of people with living or lived experience with homelessness. And they helped to identify those barriers and bright spots. And then the Street Outreach team helped me to craft it into the story that it became. I really acknowledged the larger continuum of local and regional services and you know, that we're really all in this together. I gave an overview of coordinated access. I talked about the importance of using real-time data. I introduced the idea of action-oriented case conferencing, talked about what our first steps will be, the next steps after that, and what our timelines will be, and concluded by just really talking about how this is really about moving towards systems thinking. And then the last hour was an opportunity for the folks in the room to really give their input into everything that they'd heard. So and then I asked for a commitment in principle if people were interested. So when people went around the room, they talked about these questions. I asked them what are their hopes for coordinated access, how it could help overcome current barriers and enhance current bright spots. I asked them what their questions or concerns were about coordinated access and what we need to ask other communities. I asked how best coordinated access could work here and what their initial thoughts were based on what they heard, into the details of how it might look. I asked what values or principles are really important as we embark on this work together. I asked for some input into what our community priorities might be in addition to the Reaching Home prescribed outcomes. And then I had what I called the commitment table, where people had a sheet of paper to indicate their preliminary interest in or commitment in principle to the idea of coordinated access and what their role might be in it. So 32 people committed in principle to a coordinated, data-driven, person-centered system focus on reducing or ending homelessness in our area. And you'll note that the 32 people was not as large as the 42 people that came. And I should point out that there was nobody who, they had the option of saying, yes, I'm committed, no, I'm not committed, or not yet. And then an opportunity to say, if it was no or not yet, what they still needed in order to be able to maybe commit. And only one person said not yet, and they had some really good questions that they wanted answered before they would commit. Nobody said no. It was just not everybody was able to stay the full 3 hours. So that's why that number is a little bit smaller, and I am following up with people on that. And so on that same page, people had the opportunity to check what they saw their or their programs or their agency's potential role might be. I just wanted to get a sense of how people saw themselves involved. And 24 people in a working group and or advisory committee. 3 agencies identified interests in potentially being the lead agency that hired the staff. There's 8 potential door agencies identified, 14 people who would be interested in updating the by name list, 17 people interested in participating in a case coordination table, 12 that could offer housing resources, 8 who would report timely vacancies, 18 allied service providers who wouldn't necessarily play one of those specific roles in coordinated access, but who would make sure that people who came in through their doors knew where to connect with a door agency if they were interested in being part of coordinated access. 8 folks checked other, and 7 were unsure, but were really interested in staying in the loop. So next steps will be to pull together that advisory committee and have our first meeting, which will focus on determining who the lead agency will be, developing some terms of reference, and then finalizing that government model. So this is kind of my to-do list for the next 6 weeks. So in this process, I definitely learned some lessons, which Wally invited me here today to share with you. There are 5 specific lessons, which I'll go through in detail, and there's a bonus lesson hidden in one of them, so watch for that. So lesson number 1, just jump in. The more you engage in understanding coordinated access, the more sense it will make. You know, at first it seemed a little bit overwhelming, and I just really kept engaging, and you know, it just really keeps making more and more sense. So keep circling back. I just recently rewatched the governance webinar that I watched in my first week on the job back in October, and it just made so much more sense. And you know, this time I was like, oh yeah, okay, I can see how we can do that. I would say ask lots of questions. There are no stupid questions, just people afraid to look stupid asking. Because I really believe every question you have is a question someone somewhere else also has, and probably a question someone somewhere else has already answered. So it's about finding that person that can answer that question. So that's lesson 2, is we are not alone. There's so many great resources available to us in developing and implementing coordinated access, Reaching Home, the training and technical assistance, Built for Zero, all of these great webinars and communities of practice. It's just so helpful to know it works somewhere else and how they overcame potential challenges. Yeah, I just really encourage everybody to call other people. Don't reinvent the wheel, but make the wheel fit your town, obviously. And you know, there's so many resources out there. If you need a consent form, there's lots of examples on the Built for Zero website of all those resources. Borrow resources. You don't need to make them up on your own. And borrow slides if you're doing presentations in your community to build awareness. You know, somebody else has already said it well. Use their words and images with permission, of course. And so thank you to all those folks who have shared their slides with me that I then shared with my community. Here, you'll recognize this slide. Well, I shared it in the beginning, and I've taken it and made it my own and added other folks that are part of our, who we can connect with for support in this process. lesson number is for kids. I certainly don't view my community's coordinated access stakeholders as flies, but it's a really good analogy, and this isn't a new lesson for me. This is how I always try to work, but it's just been really validated through this process. You know, relationships and kindness and respect are I think fundamental to how we do this work. In getting people to that January 22nd event, you know, I did a lot of reaching out personally, or if I didn't know somebody personally, I asked somebody else to make that invite. And, you know, I just really stressed the importance of people's presence and participation. And, you know, just really recognizing that you know, everybody's busy and it's really voluntary for them to be in the room. And related to that is something that one of the street outreach teams said to me really early on, is just to really remember that I'm facilitating a process, not pushing an agenda. And I think that's really key. In our community, there's only a very few programs who are reaching home funded who need to participate in coordinated access. So for, you know, 95% of that continuum of community and government services, it's this and to be at the table, and I think that's really important to remember. You know, I think that when I am facilitating, you know, a lesson that I've really learned over the years is, you know, when I have a huge group of people in a room who are, you know, really engaged in a conversation, and I want to get their attention back to, you know, to move on to the next piece. I've really learned, instead of raising my voice, I have these lovely chimes, and I'll just ring them for you guys. And I find they're just such a much friendlier way to really get people's attention and move them on to the next thing that we're doing. And, you know, living in a little hippie town, it's pretty easy to buy those chimes here. And the fourth piece of this is, you know, I think optimism goes a really long way, and language really matters. I was really struck when I was at that conference in Edmonton in November that everybody was talking about ending homelessness as opposed to addressing homelessness. And I think that that's really important. And, you know, here in our community, we talk about folks with lived expertise rather than just lived experience. And, you know, one of the folks at that January 22nd event, everybody to talk about people without homes as opposed to the homeless. So, you know, really seeing the people at the center of this, and you know, keeping it really at the forefront of what we do. So this is the secret bonus lesson learned that's related to that, is that this is essentially a change management process. And it, you know, it's going from a real standard system to this more coordinated system where we really think about ending homelessness, about having a community-wide list as opposed to each program or housing having its own list, and really thinking about our clients and our resources as opposed to just my clients, my resources. So, you know, it's a really delicate balance, I think, of inspiring people to make these changes in how they work, and especially how they work together, but also really recognizing how hard people are already working and respecting what a great job they're already doing. And, you know, really making sure that we're never putting anybody on the defensive. and instead really creating a safe space where as a community we can explore and identify potential barriers in the current way of doing things and work towards improving it as a system, as a whole. And I think this is making these changes together. It's really how any of us want to make changes in our lives and grow to be better, with support, with respect, with a recognition of our strengths that we're building on, and never with shaming or blaming or you should do this, without that negativity. I think the positivity is really important. Lesson 4. So all levels of organizations, a real range of people and services, and of course, including people with lived expertise. And the 5th lesson learned and final is, I think it's really important to speak to heads and hearts and eyes and ears and funny bones, and I'll explain each of those in detail, but basically speak to entire human beings who each have different ways of learning and taking in information. So there's your data people who, it's the numbers that really appeal to them, and they need quantifiable information in order to understand and engage. And there's really powerful quantified information for those folks, like a couple of slides that Marie Morrison from Built for Zero shared with me. I think that this is just such a powerful image from Built for Zero in the States, a community that when they made their case conferencing action-oriented, their number of actively homeless, chronically homeless folks just dropped significantly. That is so powerful. In Rockford, Illinois, there's another really powerful graph of their inflow and their outflow data. And then where the box is around those bars is where they really focused on understanding their inflows. And if you're at Marie's presentation in Edmonton, they identified that there was a regional hospital that was releasing people into homelessness, and they were able as a community to sit down and brainstorm around how to make some changes. And then by the spring of 2017, they really had no inflows into homelessness, and they reached functional zero around that same time. And so that's really about speaking to people's heads, but at the same time, it's really important to speak to their hearts. So also in Rockford, there's an amazing video of the faces of Rockford and who those people are, and it's a really powerful video. I've included the link in my presentation, so you're welcome to watch it once you have the copy of the presentation. There's lots of great videos available to us to use, and I just would really encourage them. Some examples in my presentation. The by name list video, I think, is just so great at really explaining the importance of a by name list. There's this great video about birds and baseballs that really shows the importance of real-time data in addressing complex social challenges. There's also some really great images that are, really worth 1,000 words, and can just be so powerful in explaining the idea that you're trying to get across around coordinated access. So here's one, the idea of the nested lists, I think is really powerful. This is from the Coordinated Access Handbook that Reaching Home put out. And then my final point, which is actually related to another video, is that the importance of speaking to people's funny bones. This is all really difficult work, and these are really serious issues. And I think it's okay, and even really important sometimes, to share a laugh together, as people come together to work on these issues. So when we had our community awareness, and for letting me heard them through the morning. And I shared this video that Marie Morrison shared with me about herding cats. And I think it just really allowed us to end on a good note that morning. So it's just a minute long. The link is here in the video. I really encourage you to watch it sometime and maybe use it in your process. So that's all from me. Questions, thoughts?
So thanks, Lynda. Yeah, and I think we have some time definitely to open it up for some questions or comments that people have. Again, if you have a question or you want to make a comment, type it into the Q&A feature or the chat feature. And so while we give people a chance to sort of think about that a little bit, I actually had a question that I wrote down, or something that struck me at the very beginning of your presentation, actually, where you talked about, Nelson not having a vacancy rate. Like there's no vacancies, and it's been that way for quite a while. And we often hear communities sort of have these comments like, well, we don't have any housing, so why bother? And I'm curious to know, I guess, on one hand, what your thoughts are about that kind of a statement. But secondly, how, is that something that came up in your community at all? And what's the approach that your community is taking to that idea? Because it could be very easy to say, well, we have no vacancies. We don't have, housing that we can offer to these people necessarily. So is this really even worth the effort?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question, Wally. And that's the question that I had. If anybody on the webinar was in Edmonton and in any of the same sessions that that was me that was always putting up my hand for the first day and a half saying, yeah, but what's the point of having people on a list and having this process of matching them to vacancies when there are no vacancies? And I really appreciate all of the answers that I got back about that. And what my takeaway message ended up being is that, there's a 0% vacancy rate, but vacancies do become available a few times a year. This would be interesting for us to figure out as a community how many vacancies there actually come available in a year. Maybe it's a dozen or so. And so with those really scarce vacancies, I think it's extra important that the right people are connected to them. So that's one piece of it. And then another piece that I really came to realize is that the case conferencing, and every community is going to choose how they go about the matching and referral process. But I know that here in Nelson, we're going to do case conferencing because that's a model that we've done before here, and people have found it really effective. And different case conferencing groups have kind of come and gone for various reasons, but generally we do case conferencing when somebody's in absolute crisis. Then we pull together whoever needs to be around the table who's working with this person or this family to really help them to figure out how we deal with what's going on. But people really see the value in doing that regularly and doing it before people come to crisis. So there are, there may be few vacancies to match people to, but there's there are people who are in housing right now that are at risk of being evicted. And so if we can come together on a regular basis as a community and work to support those people to stay in their housing, that's a really valuable use of case conferencing. Another really valuable use can be supporting people as they become more quote unquote housing ready, to really start to address some of the other areas in their life that can create barriers to them getting or maintaining housing. So I think we've just started to really see that even with a low vacancy rate, we can still make a difference through this process, and especially around case coordination. And that graph of Abilene's chronically homeless population that showed that it went from 80 down to 20 when they implemented action-oriented case conferencing, there was no new housing built during that time. Like, it really was the process that made those changes. And so we're really excited about that and optimistic about that. And then, of course, at the same time, there's a number of people working very hard to get more housing built in our community, more affordable housing, and to get supportive housing also here in Nelson. So, that's a parallel process that's happening.
Yeah, so I think, and again, I want to mention that, when you talk about people getting housing ready, that you're not referring to that from a rights-based perspective, but more about people getting, all of the documentation in order and things like that places often require them to have in order to, actually legally take on a lease or whatever the case might be. But I think, something you're saying really strikes a chord and resonates, because sometimes we don't know what's available because we just don't know what's available. And that doesn't necessarily mean that things aren't available or won't ever be available. And, when you talk about, that there were 12 people or organizations that are, indicating that they have housing resources to bring to the table, some of those housing resources could actually be housing units. And there are some organizations that have housing units that they've just been used for a different purpose, but maybe as organizations see the value in this process, then there's 1 out of 10 of their housing resources that might be made available to the coordinated access process, and now all of a sudden you do have one more unit than you had before.
Mm-hmm.
And in addition, I really liked how you said that the process sometimes can actually just solve the problem, or not solve it, but at least help, because the community is still going to be working on homelessness, whether they say, well, what's the point in doing all of this coordinated access stuff and match people to vacancies if we don't have any vacancies? But does that mean you're going to stop working on the homeless issue in your community? No. So to me, the more we can create the coordination of all of those efforts, the more we can actually have an accurate picture of what the situation really is. And then we can say, well, you know what? Yeah, we have all of these organizations that have housing units available. Can we not talk to them now about maybe making some of those available to our system? But we wouldn't have maybe known what they have available until we put this process and structured it and put it together. So, and then the idea of prioritizing is really important in there, I think. And so you mentioned that. And so I just think that, yeah, we hear people often saying that well, we don't have a reason to start. But I think the answer to that is, and you said this earlier too, is to actually just jump in and just get started. And don't worry about the fact that or the belief that you have no housing available. You're going to figure out answers and solutions to that housing issue if you actually just get started and just create the process and take the steps that you need to take. So I think that people need to be much more abundance minded as opposed to, absence minded, or, worried about not having enough. You'll figure those things out as you go. So actually we have a question from Peggy in Cape Breton. And she says, actually, Peggy, you know what, maybe what I'll do is I'm going to unmute you, and then you can speak if you have a microphone. If you don't have a microphone, let me know. So I've clicked to allow you to talk.
Hi there, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay. Yes, so we are conducting a point in time count in April, and we did initially think we were going to do a registry week to start a by names list. We did this in 2018, but it really, at the end of it, it was work for the Housing First team and the housing support workers to really try to do follow-up with people after that. And then the list, just because we don't have a coordinated access program just yet, the list just became a wait list internally to the Housing First program. So we thought maybe, I guess our feeling is now we're on the committee of the point in time count committee. We're thinking that we're jumping the gun again in conducting another registry week. I just wanted to get your thoughts on this. You're talking about just jump in and do it, but then there's the resources to follow through on this when we really don't even have the coordinated access program up and running yet. So any thoughts on that?
So Lynda, I'll let you take a first stab at that if you want, and then I have a
Sure.
comment or two.
Yeah. Peggy, that's another really important lesson learned. Whatever the flip side of just jump in is also true. So in Nelson, I know that when our pet count coordinator was doing all of her training, there was lots of people talking about doing a registry week at the same time, and that is one of the options that people are doing across Canada. And as a community, we just said, okay, we won't be ready. We're not doing a registry week at the end of April when we do our pit count. We want to also do this carefully and slowly and properly before we roll it out in our community. So, we're definitely going to take the time to have everything really thoughtfully in place before we do a registry week. So I guess thank you for providing me the opportunity to clarify the just jump in, but then slow down, be careful, keep going. But we're choosing to do it in a really thoughtful, intentional way, because that's a really good point. And, a point that BC Housing made for us as well. So in terms of our common assessment tool, we'll be using the VAT. It's the Vulnerability Assessment Tool. It's what we use here in BC. And VATs are only, I don't know what the word is, good for 1 year, and then they kind of expire. People's situations change, and then you'd have to redo it. So we don't want to ask people a whole bunch of questions that would prioritize them for supportive housing when we don't yet have supportive housing here in Nelson. So I think that's a really good point to also not get ahead of yourselves as a community. That's what we're trying to do.
So that being said, one of something that I will throw in there, and I don't disagree at all with what Lynda is saying. I think that you have to be in a place where you're going to be able to do something productive with that by name list. But at the same time, what I would say is don't throw the baby out with the bathwater in terms of what you already have in terms of a by name list. And there's nothing wrong with, I'll use the word resurrecting that list. when the time comes. And I think that the thing to remember, though, is that I think that if you think of coordinated access as that idea of building a plane while you fly it, which is what most communities are doing, I think a by name list actually ends up being one of the main engines of that plane in order to actually truly end homelessness, because it's going to be the only way that you can truly track the actuals of what's happening in terms of your inflow and outflow. So as much as you need to, I think, be careful and timing is everything, it's still going to be a necessity at some point, in my opinion. So, you know, you already have a by name list started. It may feel like it's out of date, but it's easier to update than it is to start brand new. So, you know, you can kind of build off of what you have. We have another question. Did you have anything else, Peggy, or did that kind of?
No, that's great. That's great advice. The committee, I think, is meeting next week. We initially decided to do one, but now we're kind of thinking not. So that's great advice. And just see where I think that our nervousness is that it's going to be more work for an overworked team that's in place already. So I think that's why we're thinking of pulling back, you know, and then to have this list that exists for maybe, you know, 6 or 8 months to a year before there's a really good coordinated access approach towards working on the list. So that's where we're kind of trying to figure out the best thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe there's some things just in terms of a little bit of restructuring of what's already in place that can kind of take some weight off of the shoulders of some of those people a little bit too. I don't know, but I think actually, to be honest with you, one of my biggest recommendations right now would be that, you know, like I said, I was mentioning before, my coordinated access trainer, Jody, and I are handling all of the non-built for zero communities in terms of the training that we can provide. And Jody is handling Cape Breton. So she's been in touch with Billy, and I would recommend that, you know, you guys utilize her, and her and I together can take a look at your situation and provide you with some additional insight and stuff along those lines if you like. So we're available to help out.
Great. Okay, great. Thanks.
Yeah. So Florian also asked a question, and I'll let you respond, Jody or Lynda. What's a lead agency, and is it necessary to have a single lead, and if so, why?
That's a really good question, and I'll take a try at it, and then I'll turn it back to you, Wally, because I think you know a lot more about this than me. So a lead agency, as far as I understand it, is the agency that will oversee the planning and implementation of coordinated access, and also hire the staff that will do the work. And in our community, we see that being a coordinated access coordinator, somebody who is bringing people together for meetings and helping to develop all the policies and procedures, and facilitating that case conferencing. And then we see the need for somebody with some data and database skills to do the data piece, and that may be the same person. And then we see the importance of involving folks with lived expertise. And so somebody who would coordinate that piece as well. And again, that might be 3 different people, or that might be 1 person. We have a pretty small budget here in our small town to do all of this. So, you know, if it's 1 decent position as opposed to 3 very part-time positions, that's probably the best. So that's what the lead agency will do. I don't know if that does have to be 1 agency or not. Do you want to answer that, Wally?
Well, there's several ways that it can be done. Like sometimes the quote unquote lead agency does end up being, you know, kind of committee based. But what I will say is that in some ways that defeats the purpose a little bit of what the lead agency is meant to be. One of the reasons that it's so important is that this process is something that it can't be done very well anyways when it's just a corner of multiple people's desks. And so what a lead agency allows for is for a leadership component that actually takes the lead on the organization, the structure, the monitoring, the quality assurance, all of that stuff around making sure that the system stays well oiled and functioning effectively. And it keeps everybody informed. They make sure that training is happening and that everybody that needs training gets training and so forth. And that's difficult to do when you have multiple people who are, it just is a small piece of their current job. So a lead agency sort of takes that and makes it kind of, this is our role. And we are taking the responsibility, and we are going to ensure that these pieces happen, and that the system sort of is all on board with that. And the system has said, yeah, you know what? They maybe don't pay our, write our paychecks or anything like that. And they're not our official employer, but from a systems perspective, we have all agreed that we are going to sort of be accountable to this lead agency. And we are actually wanting them to make sure that they support this system so that it works effectively. They kind of become the glue, in a sense, that keeps the coordinated access process together. And so we often talk about how, if possible, and it's not always possible, but if possible, that the members of that lead agency, they should be dedicated positions that are, and Reaching Home actually has provided funding for at least one of those positions, right, to communities. So they're for a period of time anyway. And so that's really the purpose of the lead agency, is to kind of be the eyes and ears and the ability to assure that the system is working as efficiently as possible.
Well, can I just add one thing? Just the governance webinar that you gave in October, that's in the archives on your website,
Mm-hmm.
is a really great description of lead agencies and how they fit within the larger governance model. So I'd really encourage people to watch that webinar. I found it really helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Linda, for that reminder. And it outlines about three different sort of potential models, in a sense, that a community could look at in governance of lead agencies. So Florian, I hope that speaks to your question a little bit. You also asked a question about assessment tools, and do we know anything about any officially translated versions in French? And you know what, that's a really good question as well. To be honest with you, I have to check on this. Now, I know that the VAT and the SPDAT are both already entered into HIFIS. And so, but I can't honestly tell you if they are in French in HIFIS or not. So that's a good question. So I will look into that. If somebody else knows the answer to that, feel free to speak up. But otherwise, I'm not sure about that. So that's something that I will look into, definitely. And so Florian, feel free to email me and I can get back to you with some information on that. So I think I don't see any other questions at the moment. Oh, there, somebody just jumped in. Just Florian saying thank you. So that's good. We get a thank you. We know we've done something right. So anyways, any last comments regarding your presentation, Lynda?
No, just that, you know, if you have any advice for me, I'd love to hear it. My email address is there. You know, I'm just so happy that we're all in this together, and we'll just continue supporting each other as we go through this process.
Mm-hmm. Now, Lynda, if you'd quickly just stop sharing.
Yep.
And I'm going to just pull up one more slide to show people, just as a upcoming webinars. So on February 20th at 1 o'clock Eastern Time, we are scheduled for a Housing First community of practice webinar related to community and social integration. So for people who are implementing Housing First practices, you can register for that webinar on our website, as well as the next one for bind and listen coordinated access. This is a webinar that'll be mostly presentation, will be on data improvement. There will be more data and improvement, sorry. There will be more, a more detailed title coming up very quickly, and who the presenters are for these, but those are both available to register for on our website now. So I just wanted to thank everybody for attending, and hope to see you in future webinars, and wish you a wonderful rest of your week and a great weekend. And for those of you that will be getting the time off on Monday for Family Day, happy Family Day. And again, thanks a ton. Thank you so much, Lynda. Appreciate you doing that for us. And you guys, y'all be careful out there and have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.